Hello, and welcome back to Preventing Prevent at Cambridge University, our campaign against the government's repressive, racist, and ineffective counter-extremism policy. This is the third episode in a series of interviews aimed at providing insight into not only the PREVENT programme, but also the broader issues that PREVENT is both a symptom of and has contributed to. We've previously spoken to Dr. Tariq Younis on the workings and effects of the PREVENT agenda, and Professor John Homewood on the broader context of British multiculturalism and its discontents. Now we're going to take a deep dive into the topic of Islamophobia and attempt to understand what it is, how it manifests in different situations around the world, and what effects it's having here in Britain specifically. I'm delighted that we have with us to discuss this Professor Salman Sayyid. He's the chair in social theory and decolonial thought and the head of the School of Sociology and Social Policy at the University of Leeds. Professor Sayyid is the author of A Fundamental Fear and Recalling the Caliphate, and he has developed the field of critical Muslim studies, which you can learn more about in the journal Reorient, of which he's the founding editor. He's written commissioned reports for government officials, including ministers, and he's fairly recently been involved in the construction of the definition of Islamophobia put forward by the APPG, the all-party parliamentary group on British Muslims. So, Professor, thank you so much for coming on. It's a real honor.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
I want to start with a discussion of the all-party parliamentary group on British Muslims' definition of Islamophobia, which has been adopted by all the major political parties in the UK, apart from the governing Conservative Party. So the APPG definition says that Islamophobia is rooted in racism and is a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. So why do you think it's important that Islamophobia is defined as a type of racism? How does it help us to tackle the problem of discrimination against Muslims?
I think we have to understand what the purpose of a definition was when we sort of, me and my colleague Abdul Karim Vakil, when we submitted our submission, said the definition of Islamophobia should be as a type of racism that targets expressions of a Muslimness or suspect, that was our main kind of, or perceived Muslimness was our main kind of thing. And there were two reasons we did this. One, I think it's important to see Islamophobia as not something exceptional and something very, very different from racism. So part of it was a calculation that in this country, over the period of the last 50 years, through various anti-racist struggles, through various kind of mobilizations, there has been a general advance in literacy about racism. And there are many ways of indicating that, but it kind of, and I think, you could look at it from football matches where, if you look at the experience of Black footballers in the 1980s and then experience now, that doesn't mean that things don't happen, but you actually have clubs taking action, kicking people out, taking away memberships, those who are caused to be doing racist chants, etc. So there is a general culture in which most people in this country have some idea of what racism is. If you tell them Islamophobia, then it was very, very difficult to get that translated into effective action, because you'd think, well, we need to set up this, we need to know this about the religion, we need to know all of this. And in fact, you see these kind of things. We want to make the argument that actually it's a type of racism because that's how it operates. And in which case that most organizations, including universities, most large public organizations, already have well-staffed, if not necessarily very active, methods and mechanisms of dealing with questions of racism. So if you include that within that remit, you don't need to invent another administrative structure or anything else. You can simply say, look, it's a problem of racism, it's like racism, we can do something about it. Now, part of it is, of course, Islamophobia emerges because the initial legislation in the UK didn't prevent people from being racially excluded who were Muslims. So the only two faiths who were covered was Sikhs and Jews, because they were considered to be sort of ethno-religious as well. So they were considered to have that. Whereas Muslims come in all colors and all shapes and all sizes. So within the kind of ethnoscape of Britain, it was difficult. Even the majority of the Muslims in this country are from South Asian backgrounds. You could always find Muslims who were, from Africa, Muslims who were from Australia, whatever. It was in the country. So partly it was to recognize that racism is not about races, in a sense that one of the models that we still have is that because races exist, there is racism, when in fact the reality of the situation is that racism creates races in the first place, right? Because we then view and construct people through races. And if you don't believe me, I'm not saying you do, if you are a Muslim and you go through the airport now, and if you remember what it was like going through the airport, 20 years ago or something like that, it's a very, very different experience. How? It's because airport security has become literate in how to read Muslims or read Muslimness, markers of Muslimness. And often the people who are doing them themselves are probably Muslims as well. But there is a way of a certain suspicion around what it means to be a Muslim. So it's not simply that, it's not a matter of their faith or their conviction, but you work out who a Muslim is by other markers. So in a sense, you have the racialization of Muslims. And that is what we're dealing with in Islamophobia, is the racialization of Muslims. And that's why I think it was important for us to see it as a type of racism rather than a matter of theological differences and disputes. Often those who defend, who want to carry on being Islamophobic, often make this out to be, this is a huge theological issue. It's rarely a theological issue at all. I mean, this is not about theology. It really comes into theology. It's not about, whether you believe in one God or whether the Trinity is actually a manifestation of Tawheed or not. This is not the kind of graffiti that gets written on, it's not there. It's not Trinity forever and Tawheed out kind of thing. It's not the kind of things that you get on street walls and things like that. So I think for those sorts of things, all the panoply there is racism. And our argument was that if you saw Islamophobia as a type of racism, it would allow you to mobilize against it more effectively.
Thank you very much for that very detailed explanation. And of course, we might think about, the fact that the Conservative Party is not happy with the definition, the police are not happy with the definition. And of course, this makes sense when we consider that certain policies, like the Prevent agenda, clearly discriminate against Muslims in the sense that would prevent Muslims are by far disproportionately referred to the program. And if Islamophobia is defined as racism, a policy like Prevent or Schedule 7 at the airport is racist. And so there's an obvious reason.
Well, I think this is very, very interesting. When you say the police is not against that, we know that, for example, some of the police organizations said that they don't like the definition because it would make their job impossible. But it seemed to be the subtext of that was that policing is only possible if you're going to do racist policing. And the whole import of the Stephen Lawrence inquiry was that, in fact, the policing to be effective should not be racist. I mean, that seems to me, and I think it's a kind of dereliction of imagination that you think that only way you can do police is being allowed to be racist, because if you don't accept the definition, you think because the definition says Islamophobia is racist and this will stop you from being policing. So you're saying that the only way you can actually do policing is by being racist. You just don't want to be called out. I mean, that's the only, So I think I think there is a lot of there's a degree of you said there's a degree of discomfort around that expansion, because right now you can make the case that and people have that certain kind of patterns of exclusion, discrimination are carried out against expressions of Muslimness in a way that perhaps is not always apparent for other groupings and other ways of thinking about people. So I think that's, nobody wants to be called a racist, but racism persists in this country. And yes, I think you've made the point about the Conservative Party And I wonder whether, to be honest with you, that this new Labour Party under the new leadership would have actually accepted the definition as well.
Yeah, they've readmitted Trevor Phillips into the party, who of course allegedly made Islamophobic comments, and he was removed under the previous leadership. So let's now take the global picture with regards to Islamophobia. You've previously written and spoken about Islamophobia as being about modernity, that to become modern in many countries is seen as requiring the expulsion of Muslimness. Now, I think this is a fascinating idea, especially when we look at Islamophobia in Muslim majority countries, which we here in Britain don't often think about. So the Turkish Republic, when it was formed after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, severely repressed Islamic practice in many ways in the quest to be modern, and modern specifically in an imitation of the European ideal. So if you're a Turkish woman who wore the headscarf, you'd have to remove it to enter a university. The call to prayer was not allowed to be recited in Arabic for a long time. The Sufi orders were made illegal. And similarly, in Morocco today, there are some restaurants and hotels which won't admit women who are wearing the headscarf. So I wonder if you could expand on this idea of Islamophobia as being tied up in many places around the world with what it means to be modern.
I think the first thing I would say to you is this, that despite the talk of multiple modernities, which I think is, it's interesting, the template for being modern remains a particular reading of European or Western history. Yeah. And the trouble with that reading is also the reading that sort of a post-Enlightenment reading of Europe's own history, and that becomes so if you ask what made Europe, what is modernity, we end up using pictures mainly from European stroke Western history and examples and exemplars. So modernity then becomes a way of replicating what happened in Europe. And one of the arguments that is made is that it was secularism that made Europe modern. Now, there are, and then that becomes mobilized in relation to Islamic societies, in which, for example, colonial administrations spent a lot of time closing down madrasas, attacking Muslim cultural and knowledge production, taking deliberate actions to unravel that in the name of modernity. And you see a similar thing now, for example, in Afghanistan, that again, as the British and American troops and leave, they have rediscovered again the desire of the Afghan women, the way to rescue them. But what is an Afghan woman? Afghan woman is someone who is dressed in a particular way, who must behave in a particular way. Those are the kind of markers of that. For example, the plight of the rural women and others who may not be part of that lifestyle is missing from the equation, in a sense there. So there is an element around, what people call femo-nationalism. And, Leila Abu Khalagad and others, and Gorky Bhattacharya written about the relationship between, for example, the war on terror and the desire to rescue Muslim women from dangerous brown men as a justification, which is trotted out at various points around these kinds of wars. So there is a whole set of that, but the main argument about modernity was being that if the modernity is to be understood, then part of it has always been implicitly or explicitly as a form of westernization. And one way of expressing westernization would be the expulsion of the Islamicate, because one of the arguments you could make is that how Europe considers itself as being something which is outside the Islamicate. Islam is outside Europe, so that's one of the frontiers of European identity. A couple of decades ago, when there was a dispute about the European Constitution, one of the issues was what should be the role of Christianity. Why is it that Turkey has not been allowed to become a member of the European Union, even though countries which did not exist when Turkey first applied have become members of the European Union? There are all kinds of infelicities that you can get raised on and can really be played out like that. So in many countries of the Muslimstan, there was a post-colonial elite which internalized many of these elements of Islamophobia and then reproduce them and act as validators, as this kind of comprador, global comprador, native informant saying, oh, this is exactly necessary. You can see the role of these groupings in their support from LCC against Morsi, against overthrow the only democratically elected government in Egypt, overthrown after 1 year because it was considered to be so violent and so repressive. And the repression that has been unleashed since then has no analog in recent Egyptian history. You can see this in many, many instances where, for example, you mentioned some of the issues around dress, your adhan, the calendar, all of these kind of attempts to replicate that. So one of the examples is this, that Islamophobia becomes legitimated because some of the best Islamophobes are actually either those who may describe themselves now, redescribe them as ex-Muslims, or those who are Muslims and but at the same time are Islamophobic, and that's not an incompatible kind of process. It's actually something that's quite common in many ways. So I think modernity itself is templated on Westernization, and to demonstrate Westernization, you would have to show that there is an absence of Muslimness. And you see this even in places like China or India or other parts of the world where their credentials of being modern depend on some extent being able to replicate what they understand to be part of that kind of progressive world agenda. And that is no place for Muslims.
Yeah, because that makes me think of in China, much of what China's doing to the Uyghur Muslims is about trying to eliminate them as a distinctive ethnic religious group because they're seen by the Chinese government as an obstacle to the economic development and modernization of that region. So that's an argument made by Sean Roberts in his recent book, The War on the Uyghurs. I wonder what you think of the situation in India is interesting because, of course, the sort of Hindutva nationalists, part of their sell to their base is that we're sort of rejecting the kind of Western liberal model that was kind of represented by Nehru and sort of the early leaders of India, and sort of Hindutva is a kind of rejection of that. And of course, they say it's sort of return to authenticity, but it is obviously a profoundly modern movement kind of based off the 1930s European fascist movements. So how would you say we see sort of Islamophobia operating in India? What's your reading of it? Is it about kind of a racialization of Indian Muslims? To what extent is it about kind of modernization and westernization?
I think you have to understand that, I mean, I think you made the point already about the 1930s influence of fascist ideology or Nazi ideology. So I think there is a whole issue about Aryanism and the redescription of the true Indian as part of that kind of Aryan heritage. And that allows that to be part of that kind of white crisis of whiteness. So you have, as I've written, in the book, edited the book with Abdul Karim Wakil, Thinking Through Islamophobia, we've talked about there's sort of a number of theaters in which Islamophobia is performed differently, slightly. And one of those theaters is countries in which there have been Muslims before there were countries, all right? So I think India, Thailand, China, all of these form into that because the modern construction of those states take place around Muslimness rather than Muslims as immigrants or recent arrivals and things like that, yeah? But in all of these cases, then the idea of where Muslimness prevents that nation fulfilling its destiny is clearly articulated. And the question is that how is that register made? Now, it comes after decades of shining India, the idea of India now being a major world economy, as being a major world power, also aligned now more and more with the United States, so there's all of these movements. So on the one hand, it will see itself against the kind of Nehruvian secularist left, which wasn't particularly secularist or particularly leftist, but that, you know, in those terms, but it sees itself as part of that global right-wing discourse that, you know, you see in Trump. There's a global Trumpism in a way, and it's not, and the issues is not about so-called populist leaders, but really is the frontier around Islam. You have to ask yourself, why is it that white nationalists in the United States or in Hungary or, you know, similar groupings in India and other parts of the world, why do they all pick on Muslims? What is it, the fascination that despite all the differences that they see this thing? And you can see the crossovers in the literatures, you can see the crossover in the idea of the construction of Islam as this peculiarly bloody and violent phenomenon in world history. So there are these kind of linkages which play into that. And I think in the case of India, you're quite right that they do have this critique of this sort of secularism, but in that sense, they're not that different from the critique of the, you know, what I call white revanchists, basically a critique of the so-called left in these countries, these progressive liberals who allowed our country to be contaminated through multiculturalism, Muslims and Marxists. And in fact, you know, this is a phenomenon that even in the Netherlands, you know, Pim Fortuyn was assassinated, and he was one of the main articulators of this kind of the three M's: multiculturalism, Marxism, and Muslims are the ones which are really stopping our society being that. So I think you can see that circulation of those discourses in different places. And you can see how that, you know, in the case of the Uyghurs, it comes into a very kind of developmental logic, but you can also see they're using the same vocabulary of countering violent extremism and terrorism, which has been pioneered in the United States and in Britain. So it's all about, you know, I suppose the way the Uyghurs are being treated is sort of prevent with steroids, you know, in a sense that, but it's the same logic. The logic is this, that we've got to stop the radicalization, we've got to make sure that these people are educated properly, etc., etc. And that's what's being meted out to them. So in a sense, there is a global kind of project for the kind of around Islamophobia, how it treats Muslimness. And there's a lot of similarities, but also exchanges of how to deal with these issues.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That's really interesting. So returning to Western Europe now, the country in Western Europe in which Islamophobia is having arguably the biggest impact is not Britain, but our neighbor France. And their Islamophobia is very clearly tied up, I think, with the question of the nation state and loyalty to the nation state. So President Macron's new Charter of Principles for French Islam, which he's sort of coercing mosques to sign, demands that Muslims place loyalty to the French Republic and the values of laïcité, France's brand of secularism, over their loyalty to Islam. Now, the panic surrounding French Muslims is escalating over there to the extent that the prospect has even been discussed by far-right French politicians of internment camps being set up for people who aren't criminals, but who are deemed to be radicalized. Now, this idea is basically Britain's Prevent program on steroids, and it also sounds a bit like what China is doing to the Uyghur Muslims. And it is an incredible thought that mass internment camps could once more appear in Europe. And of course, it's not an imminent prospect, but the fact that it could have been raised as an idea is in itself remarkable and an indicator of how things are really escalating. Now, in an episode last year of the Network Reorient podcast, you said that what we see in France is an Islamophobia without limits, in the sense that we don't know how far it can go. We're watching it unfold now. So what do you think about the situation for French Muslims? Are they facing, as some political commentators suggest, the possibility of an insurgent fascism, or is that too alarmist? How far can this go?
Look, the problem with language of insurgent fascism is only because it becomes unclear what people mean by fascism. But I would certainly say that they are facing severe challenges. I would also add Austria to the list, that I think, you know, many of the things that Austria has been able to accomplish, because it doesn't have the same kind of weight internationally, France is doing. So there are a number of countries within the European Union, you can add Hungary, etc., who are certainly on that path of institutionalized Islamophobia, but also institutionalized Islamophobia with a very activist government agenda. So it's almost, you know, a government which prides itself on being Islamophobic almost, yeah? The complicating factor with all of these elements is that, you know, there are always in all of these things a certain amount of short-term calculations, people put it there, but this is something that it's not just Macron. This has been a development in France, which has been going on for a while. My only concern is that often people across the channel, and you know, always think that the other side is somehow the problem one, and we've got it all sorted, vice versa, kind of thing. And I am less sanguine that these processes have some sort of limit, that they stop because of Brexit or they stop because of the channel. I think the only way they can stop is by you know, struggles and arguments to stop them, to mobilize to stop them, rather than just waiting for them to stop. There is no indication of that. There is a level of you know, I don't even know what to call it, but there's a kind of insane panic about Muslims. So for example, in the Czech Republic, where I think it's got the smallest Muslim population in the European Union of about, it must be less than around about 3,000 or something like that, or 10,000, something like that, really, really small, in a country of about, you know, many millions. And there are politicians who talk about the Muslim demographic apocalypse, where Muslims will within 10 years become a majority. Now, again, I'm not, you know, again, these are sort of tropes which circulate around. If you look at in the United States, the number of states which have introduced legislation against Sharia being used, or anyway, or denying the idea of Muslims, Islam being a religion because of trying to remove it from constitutional protections, have no correlation with the number of Muslims in those places. In that, this is not dissimilar to racism. In fact, racism tends to be highest where there are fewest ethnically marked populations. The narrative is always that because you've got lots of these racially marked population, that's where you have the highest form of racism. In fact, the reality is always the other, both in terms of experiential level. As a person of color, you are much better off in an area with higher population percentages than you being the only person, you know, and that has all its kind of markers, both sort of, like I said, institutionally, socially, sociologically. So I think what is happening in France is incredibly worrying. I think there are too many groups and organizations and thought opinion makers who don't see the potential where this is leading up to. Because the point isn't so much that people are saying that these internments can happen, won't happen here. Well, why won't they happen here? The Japanese were interned in the United States, but the German Americans were not interned in the United States. You know, it's only, I think, in Clinton's time that there was an apology given to that. There is absolutely no reason why these things cannot happen. The biggest problem in all of this is Europe is struggling to deal with its provincialization, to deal with its decentering. It used to, you know, straddle the globe as being basically the world was built around it. Now it's having to get used to the idea that the world is not built around it. And there is this crisis of European identity, Europeanness and Westernness, and which is expressing itself around many of these kind of markers. So in a way, what you have is almost the kind of hollowing out of democratic and liberal rights, quite clearly. That's been going on for some time. I think the war on terror actually accelerated that process, because whereas the Cold War was the competition to try and secure the kind of liberal settlement, you know, all the kind of freedom of speech, etc., etc. What you had here is the opposite. Well, we've got to prevent radicalization. So we've got to make sure that people don't carry maps in cities, or they don't read the wrong kind of books, or watch the wrong kind of videos, because they can simply become completely denounced. So again, it's interesting, during the Cold War, who was stopping what kind of propaganda, and who's now saying we can't stop that propaganda, we need to ban it. So that's interesting. So I think the developments in France, I think, are not short term. They're not just based on the career of Macron. I think they're fundamental about reshaping French and I think European identity. And I think the struggle for Muslims is very, very severe. We know that many, many Muslims are, you know, not only persecuted, but experiencing that, you know, anti-racist, anti-Islamophobic organizations being shut down. There is no reason why this cannot happen elsewhere, you know.
So, I mean, that's interesting that you seem to be warning against complacency here in Britain. Now, I wonder if you could talk a bit about sort of the just on that point, the difference between France's political culture and Britain's. So obviously in France, we might say that a lot of the kind of ferociousness of the Islamophobia there has a lot to do with laïcité and the particular historical trajectory of laïcité. So the interior minister expressed his horror at the idea that there was halal food in a supermarket, and you know, we have the hijab bans in schools, the ban on the face veil in public, and all the discourse there in France is very sort of centered on the idea of laïcité, and Muslims are sort of basically too religious. Their religion is too much in the public sphere. Now, to what extent do you think Britain's different form of secularism with a different historical trajectory will protect it from going down some of the same directions as France? Or do you think that that's not the case?
Look, one of the biggest issues in France is not solacity, is its unchecked racism. One of the things in France has been, for very peculiar developments, is that they've never really seriously admitted to the existence of racism, partly because of the consequences of the Algerian War. And we have to understand the Algerian War is not a purely colonial struggle because Algeria had become annexed to France. It was supposed to be as French as Marseille or Nice or whatever. So in a way, it replicated the model of racism rather than the model of colonialism. And you know, the violence against the violence in the Algerian War, you have to forget, you know, 1 million Algerians were killed out of a population of 10 million. The introduction of electric torture and new innovation techniques in torture was underdone under the French Republic. You know, that's innovation on that. So there is a huge element of that which drives some of those anxieties, etc. The fact that France doesn't produce statistics on racism, you know, it just simply thinks that because everyone is French, it doesn't need to do that. Having said all of this, I think that the question about laicite therefore has to be seen not as a kind of different parts of secularism, etc., but I think different kind of political logics. And I think part of it is the ability of communities to organize and to be able to resist the imposition of particular kind of racial logics. Now, I think you know, there's a wider history here of the effects and the consequences of the civil rights movement in the United States, how instrumental it was in terms of empowering, invigorating other movements for civil rights throughout the world, how it actually was able to link up with the anti-colonial struggles. And at that moment when the anti-racist struggle and the anti-colonial struggles were joined, was the most kind of progressive moves against white power and white supremacy. So I think one of the things you have to say is that there's those circuits of civil rights resistance have spread in the global north in very kind of differentiated ways. So one of the issues has been that, you know, if you think about the involvement of ethnically marked population in the political processes, and you see the kind of exclusion of that. A part of it's to do with, you know, different ideas of trajectories of citizenship, that really if you know, your loyalty was to the crown and you didn't have this kind of very demanding prescription on what a citizen looks like. So there are obviously changes, but I would just be very, very cautious about resting on those changes, because for me, the only thing that's different is the ability to have a Muslim community in this country, which is far more active, empowered, despite all of its criticism, than elsewhere. You have to ask yourself, why was Britain the only place where none of the press published the cartoons of the Prophet? Even, the right-wing press didn't do it. And part of it was that they recognized the strength of the Muslim community, in all kinds of different ways. And you can see that from when you talk to the editors and things, the decision of doing this. So I think it's to do with sort of a balance of forces around those who are in favor of building societies which are inclusive and those who are not, and those limits of that exclusion. And I think in countries where what is inclusive is determined by the included solely, have a very different agenda or a vision of what inclusion looks like. And in places where the included is something that the excluded can intrude upon, you've been able to have a different kind of settlements and arrangements. But all settlements are human, and therefore they're all provisional in one sense. They can be undone. So I think we just have to be vigilant and not complacent that, oh, well, that's just French and they just do their things a different way than us.
Right. So yeah, no, that's interesting about the differences. And we might think about the fact that in Britain, politicians speak about the Muslim community, and they regularly wish minority religious communities well on their religious holidays, whereas in France it's a big difference because there is no Muslim community in France as far as the government is concerned.
But Imran, remember this, that the Muslim community was not something that was agreed. One of the fantasies that some people on the Islamophobic left have is that somehow Muslims and Muslimness was promoted by the state. Now, the reality is this, that if, for example, you wanted to set up a center for a cultural center for Bangladesh, you would be much more easy to buy support. If you wanted to set up a Muslim cultural center or something like that, you would find a lot more opposition. That's always been the case. The ethnoscape of Britain was divided initially for historical reasons, between black and white. Then in the 80s, you had the idea of this notion of the brown or the Asian, so it became black and Asian. But it's only through Muslim mobilization, which interrupted the idea of the Muslim, which interrupts both the black and the Asian, because Muslims can be black, and they can be Asian, they can be white. And that is actually something that wasn't something that state promoted, wanted to happen. It resisted, but it could not resist. So in that, I think, 89, the mobilizations around the satanic verses were really, really instrumental in creating both a kind of expectation among Muslim communities, because it broke that kind of bargain, the social contract that many Muslims had between, let's say, the comprador, ethnically marked intellectuals who gained their prominence by somehow being representative of the voice of the ethnically marked, but then felt that they owed no responsibility to the ethnically marked. So that's what the satanic verses breaks that link there. That and I think that was very, very important in that mobilization of Muslimness. I mean, I've written or argued some places that before 1989 there were no Muslims in Britain. And that doesn't mean there weren't halal shops and there weren't mosques and things, but there were no Muslims as a public subjectivity. There were Pakistanis, there were Bangladeshis, there may have been, Arabs of various kinds. There could have been lots of groups, but there were no Muslims. And since then, you have the idea, a category called Muslim, which floats, circulates, which politicians of all hues, point themselves, suddenly they become Muslim overnight, and you commentators and things like that. So there is a category called Muslim, which is part of framing public life and public discourse in here. And I think that happened not because it was given. It happened because there was a process of struggle and mobilization and argumentation to make those changes. And that's why I think, campaigns like yours and others are really, really important, because ultimately This is about political work. This is work about changing hearts and minds, changing people's minds and being engaged. The thing that I would say is that if you're against us, it's very easy to stop Islamophobia. All you have to do is stop being an idiot. And here, I mean, in the Greek sense, idiots, there were people who would not necessarily that were intellectually challenged, but they were publicly challenged. They did not engage with the polis. And I think it's really, really important for those who are minoritized to be engaged in the polis, because otherwise the polis cannot be kept honest. And the real polis, of course, had no place for the minoritized. Athens, there was no place for being women or for being foreigners, etc. So I think, if you're going to talk about, rather than talking about democracy as a lesson you teach everybody else in the world, maybe it's something that needs to be practiced rather than a slogan. And part of it is this kind of capillary action, that you kind of take these engagements, create these public spaces and work towards them to shape them in a way that do not exclude you and take away your own capacity to be engaged as a member of that society.
Thank you very much for that. So looking at Britain specifically, what would you say to some of the commentators who would argue, some Muslim commentators who would argue that with sort of the receding of the post 9/11 moment, the decrease in salience since a few years ago of Muslim violence in Britain, people are far less concerned about that now. The threats perceived to be lower. What would you say to those arguments that actually now the worst is over and the worst of the sort of Islamophobia, which obviously didn't start with 9/11, because like even in 1997, Runnymede were talking about Islamophobia. It wasn't straight after 9/11. But what would you say to those who would say that sort of the worst is behind us? Is that something that you agree with, or do you think that that's not true?
Look, I mean, we all pray that the worst is behind us, but at the same time, there is no indication or no guarantee that it is the case. It's certainly, I mean, if you think, firstly, I think the point you make is very apt. Islamophobia did not begin with the war on terror. And that's, documented, like you said, the report was in 1997. And you could argue that, in fact, the campaigns around that, are even a decade before that, literally in a way. So that's the first thing. I think the issue around violence and things like, I've been studying Islamism for more years than I care to remember. And there's a kind of a cycle around this phenomenon. Every now and then, someone will tell you that this is the end of political Islam, and everything has been solved and the problem is dealt with, it's gone, and we can move on. And then something happens, and then we're back again. So if you think about it, even a few weeks ago, there was no idea that the whole idea of sort of Islamism is basically a busted flush was quite commonplace, nothing to worry about. And then you explain this kind of bewildering victory of the Taliban in overthrowing the occupation and the government and marching into Kabul. Whatever else may unfold, it definitely suddenly changes the perception that actually this is a completely finished project. Similarly, promises were made that once Osama bin Laden was killed, everything will be finished and it'll be all back to normal again. And then, of course, you had the outbreak of these warlords of ISIS and these kind of neo-Ba'athist, Takfirists, of ISIS, etc. And that became the big kind of story. Now, if you keep going back almost 50 years of this cycle, you see this repetition. And partly it is because Islamism has never been taken seriously in a kind of world historical sense. It's always been treated as a kind of either some sort of short-term craze with no rationality to it, without recognizing the long-term structural effects of producing it, which are not what people think is producing it, right? So if you remember, I don't know if you remember, I'll say this, Imran, without insulting your age on this, but there was a situation in which there was the initial 7/7 bombings, which it turned out that those who carried it out were from Kashmir. And you have this period when all the reporters and commentators are rushing off to Kashmir to find out what was the reason for it. And it was to do with poverty. It was to do with the Kashmiri Brotherly system. That was the main factor involved in this, and this was the thing. A plot which didn't work out, which involved mainly people from the Horn of Africa. So, okay, so now they're not brotherly. So what is it that Horn of Africa and Kashmir have in common? Oh, it's poverty. So that was what was driving it. And then it became a question about, well, then you had these, I think, grouping in Australia when they're carried out by doctors, and doctors tend to be wealthy. So what is it about people with brotherlies, people who are poor, people who are rich? They're all men. Then you had the phenomenon of women which had and carrying out suicide bombings and things like that. So now you have men and women, poor and rich, educated and non-educated. What is it about them which is common? And so you have this ever-expanding circle of being able to try to find out who is this, because what is being enumerated is not, it's just the various symptoms of it, not the actual cause. And the cause is a fundamental structural one, which is a problem is this right now, that, the Muslims are too strong at a global level to be ignored and too weak to be accommodated. And this is what produces these tensions continually. And that is really a problem. And various attempts to do this, and in every single instance where you see attempts to regulate and discipline Muslimness, has always been in the form of a nationalist framing, whether it's Mustafa Kemal or Macron or anyone else. What they want to do is break the idea of Muslimness, which transcends national state boundaries. The challenge for them is they're living in a period where the nation state boundaries are actually breaking down and cannot. So they're going against the tide of various developments which already weaken the nation state. So trying to assert the nation state for Muslims who don't actually have want the nation state in the first place, in the same way, is a huge challenge. And that seems to me is a logic that don't confront. So when people say to me that, the war on terror is over, well, maybe, but the machinery still exists for it. I haven't seen any of the legislation that, for example, in Britain, being dispensed with. Now, when the anti-terror legislation existed with Northern Ireland, they used to have a sunset clause. Every year, Parliament had to renew it. There were no sunset clauses that I'm aware of. This exists until Parliament actually repeals it. And I don't see that on the cards. Maybe, it will happen. But so what are we talking about, in a sense? What is happening with Macron is a very recent development. When Trump introduced the ban on Muslim travel and things like that, that was a very recent development. So I think it is a failure to recognize the challenge. What Islamophobia is now is really about the reconfiguration of the liberal democratic state. That's what the reconfiguration of this. There's a state in which certain kinds of authority, certain flows of responsibilities are being redistributed. And that's a fundamental issue. So I don't think that's changing anytime soon. And Prevent is a very good example of that. I mean, it hollows out those considered to be the sacred liberties that the West says it fought many world wars for.
I think that's an important note on which to end, bringing it back full circle to Prevent. Professor, this has been an absolute pleasure, an absolute honor. I found it really, really fascinating. Thank you so much for giving us your time with this. And thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who's listening at home as well. And hopefully we'll be back with some more interviews soon. Thank you.